This is Land of Havilah, Daniel 8. It's a vision of a ram and a goat, which according to an angel are the empires of Persia and Greece, and according to the angel, the vision has to do with the end times. Verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, even to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. Comment: in the last chapter, Daniel had what he called a dream and vision by night while his head was on the bed. Now in verse 1, 2 years have gone by, and he has a follow-up experience. It'll be the same in the sense that it's a prophecy of future kingdoms. But there's an interesting little difference that 10 times in this chapter is called a vision, and never is there any mention of it being a dream or occurring at night. It was a vision, but not of sleep. Verse 2. I saw the vision. Now it was so that when I saw, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. I saw in the vision, and I was by the river Ulai. Comment: Daniel is still in Babylon, would have to assume, because according to verse 1, he had this vision in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. But in his vision, he's been transported about 220 miles east to the citadel of Susa. At the time, Susa wasn't an important city. It was on the frontier between the Babylonians and the Medes and Persians. But soon the Medes and Persians would push west and overrun the Babylonians and the entire Middle East, and they'll establish Susa as one of their major capitals. So Daniel is standing at a spot that represents the upheavals that are about to take place. Coming up, Daniel will see a ram, which an angel will identify later as the Medes and Persians. Verse 3. Then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. The 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. No animals could stand before him. There wasn't any who could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and magnified himself. Comment: in verses 3 and 4, we can see how this is shaping up as a follow-up vision of the one Daniel had 2 years previously. The ram is the kingdom of the Medes and Persians, and there's no guesswork here because an angel is about to say so. The smaller horn represents the Medes, and the larger horn represents the Persians, because the Persians were more significant in that kingdom. In verse 3, the larger horn came up last, which corresponds to history, that the Medes were a great power beginning in the 600s BC, and the Persians weren't a great power until the 500s, so the Persians came up last. The bigger horn came up last. In verse 4, the ram was standing on the bank of the Ulai, and from there he pushed westward, northward, and southward. History tells us the Medes and Persians did just that. The Medes and Persians flourished for about 200 years. Then, verse 5, as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west over the surface of the whole earth, and didn't touch the ground. The goat had a notable horn between his eyes. He came to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I saw standing before the river, and ran on him in the fury of his power. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was moved with anger against him, and struck the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. There was no one who could deliver the ram out of his hand. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly. Comment: with respect to verses 5 to 8, an angel gives it away later in the chapter that the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. In the vision in verse 5, the Greeks swooped in from the west over the surface of the whole earth and didn't touch the ground. This was fulfilled when Alexander marched west to east and conquered everything in his path for 1,900 miles, all the way to what's now Pakistan. This erased the kingdom of the Medes and Persians, the same way the Medes and Persians erased the Babylonians. The ram had a notable horn between his eyes, which is obviously Alexander the Great. To this day, we all take note of Alexander. In verses 6 and 7, the kingdom of Greece struck the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. Greece was motivated by fury and anger. This matches with history that Alexander motivated the Greeks by fomenting their hatred for the Persians, including for the time 150 years previously that the Persians invaded Greece and destroyed Athens. It was all about anger and revenge. No telling what Alexander's personal motivations were. The fact is he riled up the Greeks by leveraging their hatred of the Persians. still speaking of the male goat, which is the kingdom of the Greeks, and the great horn of it, which is Alexander, and still in verse 8. When he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 notable horns toward the 4 winds of the sky. Comment in verse 8, when Alexander was strong, he was broken. This is a reference to him dying at the height of his power at the young and strong age of 32. 4 horns took his place. History calls them the Diadochi. They were generals from Alexander's army who fought amongst themselves after Alexander died. The result was a division of Alexander's kingdom into 4 notable parts toward the 4 winds of the sky, as verse 8 predicted. Concerning one of those kingdoms, verse 9, out of one of them came out a little horn, which grew exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the army of the sky, and it cast down some of the army and of the stars to the ground and trampled on them. Yes, it magnified itself, even to the prince of the army, and it took away from him the continual burnt offering, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. The army was given over to it, together with the continual burnt offering, through disobedience. It cast down truth to the ground, and it did its pleasure and prospered. Comment in verses 9 to 12, out of one of the 4 notable horns a little horn rose up, which is to say, out of the 4 Greek kingdoms a certain king rose up. He's not the founder of it because he's a little horn, and he rose up in that kingdom. On the one hand, it's very obvious that this is describing the Seleucid Empire during the period of Antiochus' 4th Epiphanes. It's obvious because the prophecy leading up to it is very clear. And in verse 8, it's specifically the kingdom that ruled the glorious land, which is the promised land, and Antiochus' activities are so clearly described in this passage, so it's impossible that this can be anything other than the Seleucid Empire during the period of Antiochus. But on the other hand, it's impossible it could be anything other than the government of the end times, because an angel will say so. Now, in modern times, now that we know that Antiochus' reign wasn't the end of the world, it's very clear that this prophecy must have dual fulfillment. There's no way around it. As Antiochus was, so the Antichrist will be, and as his kingdom was, so the end-time kingdom will be. Let's consider verses 9 to 12 primarily in relation to the Seleucid kingdom as it was in the time of Antiochus, and at the same time let's keep in the back of our minds that history will repeat itself when the Antichrist and his kingdom arise. The Antichrist and his kingdom will very closely reflect Antiochus and his kingdom. In verse 9, the little horn, which is Antiochus, pushed south and east, which agrees with history. And by the way, let's insert a footnote here that in these days of artificial intelligence, your narrator can read a verse of Scripture, then turn around and ask AI about the secular history of that specific moment. And in every case, AI confirms secular history to be exactly what the verse just said. Let me be clear, I don't get any interpretations from AI, but it's really good for giving very specific answers to any questions about history. And in verse 9, it's exactly true that Antiochus pushed his borders south and east. In verse 10, Antiochus grew great even to the army of the sky, and cast down some of the army and of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. This means that Antiochus availed himself of the forces of darkness, and in connection to him there was a war in the spiritual world. The forces of darkness fought with the forces of the Lord. In that fight, the demons overcame the angels to some extent, and Antiochus was able to do what he wanted in terms of trampling the glorious land. His trampling was possible because of a victory in the heavenlies. And by the way, if it's possible for a man to recruit demons and score great victories, it's also possible to recruit angels and score great victories. We need to learn something about spiritual warfare, which isn't just praying, is to go out there and pursue what's good as much as Antiochus pursued what's evil, and to pursue the magnification of the Lord as much as Antiochus pursued the magnification of himself. In verse 11, Antiochus magnified himself even to the prince of the army, which is to say he thought to put himself on a plane with God. His title, Epiphanes, he took for himself, means God manifest. Who knows whether he actually thought he was God, but he certainly tried to pass himself off as God. He promoted himself as a manifestation of Zeus, the chief of the gods. In verse 11, Antiochus took away the continual burnt offering, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. The continual burnt offering is the twice daily offering of a lamb at the temple, Exodus 29:42. The sanctuary is the temple. Antiochus put a stop to the sacrifices and desecrated the temple. He outlawed the Jewish religion and put a stop to all observances. The Scripture calls his desecration of the temple the abomination of desolation, Daniel 9:27 and Matthew 24:15. Antiochus rededicated the temple to Zeus, or we might say to himself, because he said he was a manifestation of Zeus. He built an altar to Zeus upon the altar of God, the way Josephus worded it. Antiochus personally oversaw the sacrifices of a pig on that altar. In verse 12, Antiochus cast the truth to the ground. We've seen that phenomenon in politics. The same way a mirror reverses an image, some politicians see everything backward. That was Antiochus. In verse 12, Antiochus did his pleasure and prospered. There's an idea in popular culture that happens to be true that a person could do amazing things if he sells himself to the devil, not good things, but amazing nonetheless. And all this will be true of the Antichrist. In Revelation 13:4, Satan gives his authority to the Antichrist. Therefore, the Antichrist will be able to do the amazing. He'll trample the saints, Revelation 13:7, just as Antiochus trampled the Jews. And like Antiochus, Jesus said the Antichrist will commit an abomination that makes desolate, Matthew 24:15. Specifically, the Antichrist will take away the continual burnt offering, Daniel 9:27, and he'll set himself up in the temple as God, 2 Thessalonians 2:4. The Antichrist will persecute the Jews, Matthew 24:16, and he'll persecute all the saints, Matthew 24:21. He'll be a liar, 1 John 2:22. He'll do his pleasure and prosper, Revelation 13:11-17. In summary, the Antichrist will do what Antiochus Epiphanes did in every point of verses 9-12. Verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who spoke, How long will the vision about the continual burnt offering and the disobedience that makes desolate to give both the sanctuary and the army to be trodden underfoot be? He said to me, 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. Comment, in verse 13 there's a quote, disobedience that makes desolate, end quote. Who was disobedient? Antiochus and the forces of darkness were certainly disobedient, but this disobedience is of the Jews. God promised the Jews continual victory if they would obey him, Deuteronomy 28:1-14. So there could be no desolation of the Jews or of the temple without their disobedience. Antiochus's trampling of them wouldn't be possible. But with their disobedience, the angels had no hope of victory. It must have been that the demons saw the Jews' disobedience and demanded to trample them, and God and the angels had no answer except to say, go ahead, because the promise was already in place that if the Jews were disobedient, they would be trampled. With that in mind, in verse 13, Daniel overheard one angel ask another, in effect, how long will we angels be trodden underfoot, such that there's no continual burnt offering and the temple is desolate? The answer was 2,300 days. Thanks to AI, your narrator can look up a lot of things very quickly, including the time from Antiochus desecrating the temple to the Jews cleansing it and rededicating it. It was at most 1,080 days. That leaves us well short of 2,300, but part of the question was how long the heavenly host would be trampled, which would back up the starting point. There'd have to be a judgment in heaven granting victory to the forces of darkness. Then it would take some time for Antiochus to fulfill that judgment. So if we're understanding this correctly, from the time the heavenly judgment was issued to allow the temple to be desecrated to the time the Jews rededicated it was 2,300 days. All that time the angels had to stand down and were in effect defeated. As verse 13 says, the army was trodden underfoot, and in verse 10 it's clear this was a heavenly army, the army of the prince, verse 15. When I, even I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. Then behold, there stood before me something like the appearance of a man. I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Comment: Daniel is still in Babylon bodily, but in his vision he's still a couple of 100 miles away by the banks of the Ulai River. He heard a man's voice between the banks, which must mean God, because the voice commanded Gabriel, the angel, to give Daniel the interpretation. Your narrator has already peeked ahead at Gabriel's interpretation and already explained things on that basis, but here it comes. Speaking of Gabriel, verse 17, "So he came near where I stood, and when he came I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Understand, son of man, for the vision belongs to the time of the end.'" Comment: as your narrator has already documented for you, the vision applied to Antiochus Epiphanes and his Seleucid kingdom, but because the angel just said it applied to the end times, the time of the end, and Antiochus didn't live in the time of the end, it must be that Antiochus and his kingdom are a prophetic foreshadowing of the end. Verse 18. "Now as he was speaking with me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. He said, 'Behold, I'll make you know what will be in the latter time of the indignation, for it belongs to the appointed time of the end.'" Comment: Jesus said in Matthew 24:12 that in the last days lawlessness would increase. Because of that lawlessness, God will be indignant. This is why verse 19 calls the end times, quote, "the latter time of indignation," end quote. It's God's indignation. It's the angel's indignation. It's the indignation of all God's people, and the indignation of everyone who knows his left from his right and doesn't see truth and falsehood in reverse. Now, leading up to that time, verse 20, "The ram which you saw that had the two horns, they're the kings of Media and Persia. The rough male goat is the king of Greece. The great horn that's between his eyes is the first king. As for that which was broken, in the place where four stood up, 4 kingdoms will stand up out of that nation, but not with his power. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have come to the full, a king of fierce face and understanding dark sentences will stand up." Comment: in verse 23, the Antichrist will be fierce of face and will understand dark sentences, which means he'll understand mysteries and enigmas by a dark supernatural gifting. He'll know exactly what he should do to take over the world and prosper in whatever he wants to do. Verse 24. "His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. He'll destroy awesomely and will prosper in what he does. He'll destroy the mighty ones and the holy people. Through his policy he'll cause deceit to prosper in his hand. He'll magnify himself in his heart, and he'll destroy many in their security. He'll also stand up against the Prince of Princes, but he'll be broken without hand. The vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it belongs to many days to come." Comment: we went through most of the interpretation already. In verse 25, the Antichrist will stand up against the Prince of Princes, which is Jesus. He'll know Jesus is coming and have his armies assembled, ready and waiting for him, Revelation 19:19. And the Antichrist boasting of great things, he actually believes his own boasting and thinks he can defeat the Lord, otherwise he wouldn't assemble his armies against him. He's confused because of all his victories in the past. He doesn't give credit that his victories were because he who restrains was taken out of the way, 2 Thessalonians 2:7. In verse 26, the vision of the 2,300 evenings and mornings is true, which was the time the heavenly host will stand down in defeat and the temple will be trodden underfoot. It comes out to about 6.4 years, but as we said, that might represent the time from the heavenly judgment to the time it's all fulfilled. There hasn't been a temple in Jerusalem since 66 AD, but prophecy indicates there must be a temple during the tribulation and the millennium, verse 27. "I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for some days. Then I rose up and did the king's business. I wondered at the vision, but no one understood it." Comment: in verse 26, an angel commanded Daniel to seal up the vision, for it belongs to many days to come. In verse 27, Daniel didn't understand all he wanted about the vision, and no one was able to help him out on it. The angel gave him something of an interpretation, but Daniel knew there was more to it. Some of it was sealed. As time goes by, we understand more and more. We have more history and scripture to unravel things a little bit more. We've seen some impressive fulfillments, enough that we fully expect the rest of it to be fulfilled, down to the small details. Daniel 8 is next.